Morning, everyone. I'm just going to put Johan now. Johan, sorry, you were not there before. Just going to add you now to the. There you go. Hello.
All right. Hello. Thank you. Hello, and good afternoon, or good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the first of a three session series that we're talking about. Retrieval augmented generation with Azure OpenAI and some other Azure services. This, of course, being the first session, is we're going to focus predominantly on the prompt engineering with OpenAI. My name is Jan Meiberg, and I'm a technical trainer with Microsoft here in the UK. I work quite closely with the folks from the Microsoft Reactor, and the Reactor folks, of course, have lots of in-person and online events in London and around the world, for that matter. Just a quick note, just our code of conduct, always try to be friendly and try to be kind and courteous to other folks, as we all might come to expect. But either way, without any further ado, here I'm gonna pop straight into what we're going to be talking about. We actually don't have a lot of time here. We've got 1 hour for a topic that I usually spend about 4 hours on. So let's see if we can get through as much as possible. So just a brief agenda. We're going to talk about, just touch on what is Azure OpenAI, and then we'll talk about responsible AI and how the OpenAI service can essentially assist you with that and your application. Then we will talk about the parameters that essentially control these models. We'll touch on personas, and then we will probably be talking about personas for the rest of the session. And then there's 6 strategies that we're going to focus on, or that I'll touch on at least, and show you some examples around that. But let's get cracking, and let's go see what we're talking about. First of all, what is Azure OpenAI? So I don't have any slides on this, purely because I'm going to assume that you understand what Azure OpenAI is, right? However, once you've created this service, and I'll show the service to you just briefly. Let me just pop it onto my party screen. There we go. Well, that is not the right screen, of course. So I'm going to, oopsie daisies. Well, this is a bit of a mess. Here we go. All right. So what I've got here is I've got a OpenAI service that was generated. You'll notice that, of course, we've got our keys and our endpoint, right? And out of this, I can essentially, if I click on the overview button, I can click on go to the Azure OpenAI Studio right over there. And from there, this is essentially a little portal that we've built and hooked up to your Azure instance. And you'll notice that we've got a bunch of capabilities and features here, right? You can see that there's, for example, models and the different deployments. These deployments are quite important. We're not here to really talk about this in a lot of detail, but you'll see that here are essentially all the deployed models that I've got currently. And you'll also notice that I can also deploy a model from Azure Machine Learning if I wanted to, right? So there's a couple of ways of doing that. I can even go and create a custom model if I wanted to, and tweak the model slightly. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Once I've provisioned my model, and you'll see that this appears under deployments. Once I've provisioned my model, I can either click through on the model here, like this, and specify open in playground, or I can just go to the playground and just select the actual deployment that I want to be using and want to interact with at this point. All right. And this gives me access to the model. And at this point in time, I can programmatically now start interacting with the service because I've got these keys and the endpoint. So once I've got this information, I can actually start running some introductory sort of tests in this framework, right? So you can use this playground just to get your head around how does this model work. You can see that we've got some view code options here. You'll see that we've got some parameters there as well. But this essentially gives me a strong basis to actually start off and actually start building my application and understanding and testing certain scenarios in my application. So I can go and type something like, what is the steps to deploy Kubernetes, right? Very specific question there. And it's essentially going to give me some, it's going to start giving me some of these results based on the model that I've selected here, but also based on the parameters that I've sent through. And this is what we're really here to talk about, folks. We're really here to dig a little bit deeper under these parameters and understanding how we can make this model work for us, right? And the process of interacting with this model is known as prompt engineering, right? And the reality is that even though we've got some parameters that we can use to tweak and customize the result that we get, the reality that we face is most of the time we're going to be controlling the model with actual text, right? And plain old English, as we like to say, whatever language you actually prefer. So I'm not going to, oopsie, I don't know. Something is not a very happy puppy here today. I don't know why, for some reason. My screens are a little bit messed up. So I'm not going to spend too much time around what is Azure OpenAI. I want to get into the details as to how we can actually do some prompt engineering and what patterns we can essentially leverage to do that. So there are some other recorded sessions as well around what is the Azure OpenAI service. You can actually go and check them out on the Reactor YouTube channel. So let's get into responsible AI, right? Now you might have been a little bit overburdened with communication around responsible AI, but the reality is Microsoft will take some responsibility. Your application and your organization also has to take responsibility. But we've also built some capabilities into our service that allows you to treat it a little bit more responsibly, right? And what I mean by this is our OpenAI service has essentially got some content filters that you can attach to your different models. And this is essentially going to allow me to filter in or filter out certain types of categories of information. For example, you can see there hate speech, right? Any sort of sexual conduct or violence or self-harm information, it can check against these things, and you can actually go and specify. What level of tolerance you want by either specifying safe, low, or medium. Now, important to remember that for certain types of applications, this might be different. In a corporate setting, I would imagine that you'd want to keep things as safe as possible, right? I'm building a corporate application. I want to keep things relatively above the belt, right? But if I'm building something like a social media application that the general public out there might be using, I might have to tweak this slightly, right? Because after all, out there on the internet, folks want to say their say, they want the results they want. So for a social media type application, you might be a little bit more lenient in terms of how you approach this, right? It might also be that your application needs to treat this differently based on the context of the application, right? So let's take, just as an example, I'll pop up my whiteboard here. So just as an example, I might have our API, right? This is now the OpenAI API that I've provisioned, and I've got my application. All right. Now, if this was just a stock standard type of application that just wants to do basic sort of chat type interactions, public facing, you might want to bump that up slightly, right? And you might want to allow a little bit more. But what if I've got an application, and in this part of the application, I want to treat this differently. So in this part of the application, I want it to be completely safe. And in this part of the application, I wanted to tolerate this a little bit more, right? I will actually allow things like medium or high tolerance. How do we do this? Well, the only way really is to essentially to go and create different deployments, because you'll notice if I click on one of these deployments that I've created, when I create a new deployment, this is one of the options that I get to specify, right? And you can see I get to specify the content filter for this deployment. So further to this, you'll see, for example, you can see that all of these models that I've got in here are essentially using the default content filter. But if I go for content filters at the bottom here, I can actually go and create one. And you'll notice that there is where I can specify that severity, right? For hate speech, I'm going to be, I'm happy that this, is quite low for prompts and for completions. I can set these up. And then you'll notice we've even got some additional options. We've got what's known as prompt shields. And with prompt shields, you'll notice that we can check for things like jailbreaks, right? We'll talk a little bit more detail about what that is. But if I've created the context for the application, I can essentially, I can check to see if the prompts that are coming through are asking questions outside of that context, right? And the model will pick up on those sort of things, right? So all of these items check for this, check for public protected material. You will see that it'll check for public open source code, for example. I can hook up a couple of these. And then when I create this this filter, as I create my deployment, if I create a new deployment, I can actually go and specify that filter. So it might be that for this part of your application where you want the filter to be slightly lower, you're going to create a model for that and give it its own model name with its filter. And for the other part of the application where you want a different filter, you might deploy a different model. Right, so don't be, you're essentially paying for the amount of texts that's coming through into these services. So don't feel shy to deploy multiple models here, right? Especially if you've got this the scenario where this part, where this part of the application wants to be a little bit more liberal, and the top part you want to be a little bit more safe. So that means that I might have to split it up, and I can have one application that is implemented the safe filter, and another part of the application, for example, that has implemented the, another deployed model that's implementing the medium filter, for example, and get it to interact like this. And this should give you the idea that what we're talking about here is we're talking about context, right? In this application that is calling that API of mine, the context in this part of the application might be different. And it's all really about context, as you'll see as we move a little bit forward. Right, we'll come back to that in a bit. So we can implement, we can at least assist you with some of that responsible AI by actually implementing some of these filters, right? And you can ensure that this sort of language, this sort of scenarios, violence, these sort of things are not tolerated on this model, right? So this is almost like, I see this is a type of a safety net that sits across your scenario. All right. So for the next part, we actually need to start talking about, hey, what are these parameters, right? Because I alluded to this in my introduction. I said we will also talk about the parameters. And if I can just show you some of these parameters, what we're talking about here is, as my message is being sent from this application into the API, of course, maybe it's like a chat bot and my user has entered some sort of a question, right? This question is now getting sent through to the API, and essentially the API is going to respond with the answer to that question, all right? So every request that you send through to this API is essentially going to have a bunch of a bunch of parameters, that is parameters, right? And then obviously the message, right? And you can actually see these parameters and the message if you go into the portal, right? And you look at the playground here, and you look at this chat that I've actually got going here. If I click on view code, you'll notice that there you can see that there is, if I look at the C# code, for example, you will see if I scroll down slightly that there is my temperature parameter, max tokens, and a frequency penalty. So this information, and if I flip it over to the JSON, you will see that it looks exactly the same, right? There's my message, role system. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you'll see towards the bottom here, there is my temperature, my top P, frequency penalties. All of those parameters that I'm talking about are essentially going to get sent through to the API every time you send a request through, right? So this is additional metadata that essentially sends your request, right? That is sent alongside your request, I mean, right? And we will talk about what they are in a minute. You'll see there's a couple of them. Now, the best way to demonstrate this for you is if I go look at this application. Give me a moment here, and ideally what I want to do is I want to start at the endpoint, right? So there's an application for the Woodgrove Financial Institution. You can probably imagine that if this is a financial institution, they've got certain types of customers, probably retail customers, these sort of things. And those retail customers have got different questions, right? And you can probably start categorizing them already. If you look at my retail banking option here, you will see that in retail banking, it's prompting me for some questions. Take a look here. It says this first one. What are the steps for a mortgage application? And what happens if the borrower's credit score is low? You can see that for most of these, what are the required documents? Which categories, right? Etc. So the reality is the financial institution probably want these results to be a little bit more predictive, right? We don't want one customer that gets 9 steps and the other customer gets 5 steps, right? So for certain parts of your application, in this case here, maybe for that part of the application, right? This part here, I want to set these parameters so that the model returns something a little bit more predictive. So it returns something that's not as creative in terms of the wording, but it's a little bit more standardized and simplified, right? If you contrast that with this part of the application, where this is maybe an internal marketing consultant that is essentially using the application to generate a marketing campaign or marketing information. There you can see, write the Instagram post, right? Or write an email, for example. You can well imagine that under these circumstances, I don't want it to be predictable. Under these circumstances, I want it to be as open and as creative as it can be. Use words that we don't use generally, right? All of these things can actually essentially be controlled, largely using these parameters that I'm referring to. And in actual fact, you will see on this part of the application, we've actually exposed the temperature factor to the user, right? So in certain scenarios, you might actually let your user decide. But let's quickly just touch on what these parameters are. First of all, there's a temperature parameter, right? And this is a parameter that you pass through every time you make a request. And of course, in that context, you want to keep it consistent. So, for example, if I was in this liberal part of my application where I'm going to have, X amount of information, I might actually specify here that I'm going to use a temperature of 8, right? Why? Because I want it to be a little bit more expansive and a little bit more, how can I say, creative and diverse in terms of the information that it's actually generating, right? If I'm thinking about the top part where maybe I want something a little bit more predictable, I'm probably going to set this down to 3 or something like 2, because I want that message to be consistent. I want that message not to be creative, and I want it to use more or less the same words over and over again, right? As opposed to coming up with a brand new word that describes a specific item, right? So you'll see that we've got this temperature option. And you'll notice that if I set the temperature to high and I ask it, to describe the sky is, you will see if the temperature is high, it basically comes back and says the sky is a canvas of dreams. If I set the temperature to low, it's basically just says the sky is blue, right? So that's what we mean in terms of creativity. Now, all of these examples don't work as well as that specific one, but we can also use another parameter called the top P. Now, I'm going to give you some examples a little bit later on, probably that incorporate some other scenarios as well. But the top P is very similar to temperature, right? Let me see if I can at least explain top P for you, all right? So if I'm actually asking the question, and I'm sending the request back to this API of mine, right? What is essentially happening is this API is formulating the words it needs to type back to me, right? So I asked it a question, it's coming up with these words. It's essentially what it's going to do is it's going to actually start if you specify streaming, it's going to start pushing these results out, and I'm going to start seeing the results come through in my application, right? Now, at that point, if we are looking at this first word that gets generated, you can well imagine that I might use other words. I might use the word A. I might use the word V. Let's say, for argument's sake, that there's 100 words that are likely options for that specific word that I need to send back, right? What the top P is, with top P, what we are saying of all the likely words, right? And let's say that there's 100 words that I might use. Of all these 100 words, top P is going to control what percentage of those words can be used. So if this was the most relevant and this was the least relevant, top P is essentially a slider that moves up and down here, that you can say, give me common words or give me less common words, right? So the result might also be a little bit more creative, but it's controlling the creativity using a different parameter, right? So you'll see that if you look at temperature and top P here, in fact, even if you look at our documentation, we would prompt you to say, rather use temperature or top P, but you can use a combination of these as well, right? To control exactly what the output is. You're only going to get the result and see exactly what it is if you do extensive testing around your prompt engineering, but I suppose that's a given. And then the last two here are very self-explanatory, right? By the way, an analogy for top P, I always like to say, if all the possible words for a token that it sends back is the words, and this is a party, the top P controls the words that are invited to the party. All right, so you can see it like that. Presence penalty and frequency penalties are additional parameters that you can include that will ensure that, for example, under certain circumstances, you don't mind if you see the same word twice, right? So for example, once again, with this application of ours, right, if I'm looking at instructions for an end user, I want this to be consistent. I want it to use the same words. I don't want it to use a brand new word every time I ask it the same question, right? So for something like that, you will also go let me just find this thing quickly. You will then use these presence and frequency penalties and essentially control exactly what the model is coming back with, right? So it's again, testing and what's known as red teaming is really, really important when you start building out these types of applications. And there, what I've got here is I've got some general sort of use cases, and you can see on the left-hand side here, if I was doing things like code generation should be quite deterministic, right? You can see that I've set the temperature down and the top P down. This is actually information that comes straight from the OpenAI website, right? Creative writing, you're going to set them to be a lot higher because you want that to be creative. You want the tokens that get generated to be a lot more diverse, right? Chatbot responses. There's a couple of additional examples here. Code comments, right? Maybe not down to a 1 or a 2, but at least something that's gonna be a little bit more creative because you want to describe the code, right? And then you can see data analysis, scripting, explorative code writing, these sort of things. It's got some options. Okay, so and let that be known though that when you're actually making your request, every single time you're interacting with this model, you're going to be you can send through these parameters and you can tell it how it needs to be controlled, right? And you can see that that's using Python, and if I go for something like C# here, then you'll see that there is my temperature, there's the frequency penalty, etc. parameters that I'm essentially passing through. I can probably also show you a little REST example if it's all the same to you. Let me just find it. So there's a little example, right? There's my REST API, and you can see that there's my messages, there's my key. This is just a REST call, and you can see that towards the bottom here, I'm providing that temperature 0.1. So what I've got going here is I've got you're a cowboy. I'm specifying using a system message. We'll talk about this in a minute, and then you can see I'm asking the question towards the end here, all right? But again, I'm taking those parameters whether I'm using the SDK or whether I'm using the actual the REST API. These parameters get sent through every time. All right. I've been talking a little bit about context, and I'm mindful of the time here. I've been talking a little bit about context, right? Because the reality is you can of course control this model with the requests, right? But the reality is you want to be able to give the model the context, right? So if I'm on this side, let's create a completely brand new image here. I might do this a couple of times. It's quite common for me. Right, so let's say that this is the API once again, and here is my application. Right, this is the application I'm going to have interact with this specific service. So it might be that my application is broken down into 3 main parts, right? Our application consists of a legal area, right, where there's legal information. We also have a strong medical sort of area, right? Maybe health and safety or whatever the case might be. And then we've got something that's more sort of IT related, right? Stock standard type of application. Now, it might be that each of these have their own security requirements in terms of hate speech and all of those things. But let's say, for argument's sake, that they're all using the same model and we're happy with the same security. around that. So there's a model. Let's say that we deployed the GPT-4 model here, right? What we want to start doing is, as my user interacts with a chatbot, for example, in the legal part of the application, we want the application to come across as a legal representative, right? If we're chatting with a chatbot inside the medical part of the application, we want this thing to come across as a doctor, right? We want this one to come across as a lawyer or a solicitor or whatever the case is. If on the IT side, we're interacting with a chatbot, we want the chatbot to come back as a geek, right? A real nerd that kind of knows, sort of, cheesy comment sort of thing, right? All of these are essentially personas that you can generate, but you don't generate them with parameters. And I think for me personally, this is what I like about OpenAI, right? You're controlling it with some parameters, but actually you can control it with just plain language, right? Because the reality is, if I was building my application like this, when I'm sending through requests from the legal part of the application, I will have a different context than when I'm sending requests from the medical part of the application. My context is slightly different here, right? And same for IT. I've got a different context here. And the context for legal is you need to sound like something legal. So how do we control this with OpenAI? The answer is we control it with different messages, right? And generally, there are three types of messages, right? I'm going to quickly write them down here. We've got what's known as a system message. We've also got what's known as a user message. Oopsie. And we've also got something known as an assistant, all right? System is context for the model. It's exactly that. I can use a system message, and the system message is going to tell the model, give it context, and explain to it how I want it to respond. Let me give you an example here. Take a look here. You'll see that in this example, I've got the messages, and these are the messages that are going to get sent through. The first one, system. Now, this is a very silly one. You see, you are an assistant that teaches people about AI, right? So what am I doing here, folks? I'm busy giving the model context. I'm busy priming the model, and I'm busy explaining with plain English to the model how I want it to react, right? And it is also this system message that our safety checks will check to see if someone is trying to ask you questions about something that's not in here. We will flag that as, hey, this is not the right area, right? So what we mostly do is we mostly send a system message, and we send a system message every single time, right? So we're constantly, and the reason why we're doing that is the model is not going to remember. If I say to it the one moment you're a legal eagle type or you're a doctor, it's going to reply for that request as a doctor. If I just send a request after that, it doesn't have that context. So when you're doing prompt engineering, one of the most important things, and that's what I want you to walk away from here today, is you need to give this model as much context as you can. And that starts with a system message, right? Take a look at how the system message actually controls things, right? I'm going to clear the chat out, and I'm gonna first take the default message, right? And you can see that the default message is you're an AI assistant that helps people find information, as straightforward as that, right? So you can see there that I can say, my is not starting, can you help? So take a look at the information that I'm pumping in here now. I'm asking it questions about a PlayStation, right? My PlayStation is not starting. It's likely going to come back with very generic information here. And this is what this series is all about, is how can I get it to respond with our own data? But we'll look at this on in the last session, where you can actually bring your own data, because this is very generic information, right? It probably got this when they created this model from the internet. These are the things that you can check for. But take a look here. If I say that I'm an Xbox support agent, right? I can say, yes, I'm an Xbox support agent, believe it or not. And check this out. Now, if I say my PlayStation is not starting, I'm sorry, I'm an Xbox customer support agent, right? This is the first thing that you'll probably start doing, is you will start giving the model context, right? I'm sorry, I'm an Xbox support agent. I can help you with the Xbox, but I cannot help you with the PlayStation side of things, right? And you'll notice that if I click on view the code there, you will see that it's, well, let me just pull up the JSON. There you can see the role system. You're an Xbox support agent. Role user, how much is a PlayStation 5? Well, I didn't actually type these, folks. You would have noticed I didn't type these. These are essentially, this is the playground has injected these additional questions in there to give the model additional context, right? And I'll show some of this in more detail to you later on. There you can see, as user, how much is a PlayStation 5? I apologize. I can't help with that. I can only help with Xbox items. User, my PlayStation is not starting. I'm sorry, but I support Xboxes, right? So what are we doing here, folks? We are essentially sending not only the messages that the historic messages that might have come through that the user has already got results from, but whatever else we need to send through to the model to give it that context, right? So it might actually be that in this instance here, that this was actually typed by the user. The user actually typed that, right? And this gives the model context. So my application feeds through maybe the last 5 or 6 different messages and responses, right? Because it keeps giving the context for this model. And then maybe this was the last question the user asked, and this is now what I want the response to come to, right? It might also be that this was not created by the user. It might be that your application created this. Your application created this question and that answer so that it gives the context to the model, right? To give it an example of what it wanted to, how it wanted to respond. Okay, so the idea should be that your application is going to send through the user message, right? And I've got them listed at the bottom here, right? It's gonna, because this is essentially the question your user is asking, but it's also going to come back with some assistant options, and this is how I want the model to respond. So I'm giving the model some examples of either questions that have been answered earlier or some examples of typical questions and typical responses as part of the request, right? So you can see that this is slightly different from what we have with other types of models, where we're giving it a payload and it's coming back In this instance, my application might actually save up some of that payload, right? And save up that message history. And it's very common to, for example, send through the last 10 messages and results that we've had from the model, because it keeps giving that context. And the reality is, folks, if this is how the Copilot remembers this, right? So if I say, what is the time, right, it's going to come back with an answer. But if I say, what is the time, and if I say, and in Johannesburg, I didn't ask it for the time. I asked it for the time now in Johannesburg. Why does it know I'm asking for the time? I didn't tell it anything about the time here, because this application is sending through the history, right? That's the only way to do this, is to keep sending the history through so that the model has got context. Okay, I really hope that makes sense, because that's really what we're talking about. So it's very normal for your application to be having multiple messages, not just the user message. So use the system and user and the system messages accordingly. You can, as I keep saying, you can either keep sending the history of what the user is typing, or you can also inject your own history so that it creates that context for the model. Right. I really, really hope that makes sense. And then the last thing I wanted to chat about, and I don't have a lot of time for this, but there's 6 strategies that I've got for prompt engineering. And I got this from a combination of the OpenAI website, but there's also some of this on our website. I'm not going to go down in each of these and show an example of that, but I want to just touch on some of these. The first and probably the most important one here, right? I cannot stress this, more than I'm doing right now. Instructions that are not clear are not going to have desired results. You need to be very specific in terms of what it needs to be that it's going to be doing for you, right? What the result wants to be. And it must understand, it must have context so that it understands exactly what you want. And this is the reason why certainly in some of the Microsoft tools, why we have built in, at least with Copilot, the ability to iterate, right? Don't be shy to train your users to build your application so that you can iterate over and over. If I go, for example, I'm going to just quickly pop something open here, just to show you an example of this. Give me 1 second. I can demonstrate this for you. Just give me a moment. All right, so there's a new email, right? You can see there's some contact details if you're keen on that. So check this out, folks. I can essentially say to Copilot, hey, draft with Copilot, right? What is it doing there? I want to say, I want a message to our security provider who are charging us too much. Now, what I'd like you to take a look at here is look at these options, right? Direct, neutral, casual, formal. Make it. I'm going to ignore that one. I don't have any idea why they put stuff like that in there. But what do you think we are doing? How are we getting these sort of results? We are getting these sort of results because Outlook is going to embed a system message saying you're a casual sort of employee, right? And you're wanting to write a document about blah, 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 blah. I think you're getting the idea, right? So you can also see I can specify the length of these things. So if I click on generate, for example, it's going to generate a draft. And then you'll see that I can actually go and say anything I want to change. Oh, I want to make it shorter, right? So you can see that this is how I'm controlling it. Look at how we're controlling the iteration here of this. A key part for your users is going to be to iterate, right? And you want that iteration to be easy. I mean, I don't understand why we don't just have the up arrow that you can press the up arrow and it just shows you the last prompt again, like we've got in the command line. But make it easier for your users to do this. Don't let them type out the messages the whole time. The easier you can make that, the better. Clear instructions. Take control of the request by adding system prompts, by giving some sample requests, for example. You can also use things like delimiters. I'm going to give you a quick example of this. There you can see there's using a persona, a very simple example. When I ask for help for something, you'll reply with a document that contains at least a joke or a playful comment. Now, I've also got another application here that I essentially use for some of my demos. Where is it? There we go. Hello. So I've got this example application. It's really just a simple app that I've created, right? So I'm going to copy that, I'm going to paste that in the system message, and then at the bottom you'll see I'm going to go and paste that message. There's the system message, right? Make sure that you're funny, getting deliveries on time and stuff like this. So you'll see that at this point in time in this application, I'm prompting the user for the system message. You might do that. You might want to leverage that at least a little bit, but it might also be that you're hiding that away from the user, right? So in this instance here, what I'm doing is I'm showing you all the different messages. And if I say few shot messages, I can actually go and add some messages in there. When we're talking about things like delimiters, all right, you can see that I can go and paste something like summarize the text delimited by triple quotes, right? And there I can actually go and paste something, and you can see there it's going to prompt, it's going to notice that I'm asking, this is the 3 quotes that I was talking about, right? Summarize this. I'm just going to copy some text in there, so I've got something, and you can see what that result is. Well, here we go. Steel bolts arrive. Vendors like you keep a strong success is threaded. Well, hello. We were asking for a haiku. That's exactly what it gave, right? Right. So you can see that of course the more details, delimiters, and these sort of things you are actually supplying, the better, right? You can even provide examples, right? If I'm looking for examples here, you can see that there is. Well, let me just pull this out and show this to you, right? You can see that there is an example: system message, answer in a consistent style. One user message. This is what's known as few shot learning. Teach me about patience. Assistant message. The river that carves the deepest valley, right? Teach me about the ocean. It's going to come back with something very, very similar to that. So let's actually copy these and just test them briefly. So there's the system message. And then I'm going to pop this one out. And if I ask it this question now, I should probably just put some drop downs in here at some point and hit the submit button. I should have actually done that. It's essentially going to look at the system message, make sure that it's consistent with the style, and the style it's going to be consistent with is going to be this style over here, right? So what I want you to notice, folks, is that we are completely controlling this thing with our prompts and with our languages, right? Another good example is to use something like categories, right? You can see there that we can use things like text classification. This is actually a interesting one, and you'll notice that in here I can essentially use a system message like this one, and you'll see that this is a long system message, right? It's a monster. But again, I want you to focus on the results here. That's what's important. You'll be provided with customer service queries. Classify each query into a primary category and a secondary category, and then I'm providing all of these categories. Now take note, I'm providing these categories as part of the system message, right? So don't think it's strange if this application of yours is actually reading some system messages from something like Redis cache or something that you've got on hand where all your prompts are essentially stored, right? You don't want to hard code those prompts into your application. You want these prompts to live in a system that can be updated, that you can start rolling changes for it, right? So in this context, if I now go and just ask the question, right? These are all the categories, and you'll notice if I ask the question, I need to get my internet working again. Take a look at the result that comes back. OpenAI result, primary, technical support, secondary, troubleshooting, right? It's even come back with that information in JSON because it thinks probably that this is probably going to be an application responding, not a human responding. All right. So of course you can tweak that. You can tell it what what format you want it to be in. That's another important point here. You can see that you can specify the length of output. The length of output will be a key in essentially getting the right information into a specific space of text, right? Not only that, but often a longer description reads a lot more difficult and doesn't get the point across as a short summary, right? So be very specific in terms of when you are using these things. Reference as much text as you can, right? All of these will make up your token count, and your token count is essentially where your cost lies. So you might be thinking, well, the more text I put in there, the more it's going to cost us. That's correct. You can also fine-tune your model, and you can essentially provide it with some fine-tuned data and bake it into the model if you don't want to send these system messages, for example, using that. I can give you an example of that as well, if it's all the same to you. Let me just quickly pop in here. Let me just see where I've actually got this information stored now. I rushed off there too quickly. So if I go in, you can see that there is some fine-tuning data, right? And I can fine-tune my model by giving it this information. You're an assistant that's talking about AI services. You're funny and sarcastic. What are we doing here? We're training it, right? We're tweaking it to say, hey, under these conditions, this is what you are going to react like. So you can see the assistant, you'd like to know about this. So you can give it a bunch of examples like this and fine-tune your model, and then your model is always going to be sarcastic, and then you can actually stop sending through these requests, right? But the best practices is actually that you first build it into your application before you start fine-tuning the model like this, right? I've got the fine-tuned model actually loaded here. Let me just see. That, of course, is the wrong browser. So there you can see what I've done here is create a custom model, and then you can essentially point it. You can specify GPT-4, and then you can essentially point it to your training text, And these are essentially a range of questions that you can pass to it. And then it'll essentially train that to create a custom model. And then that custom model will be available for you to interact with from your application. All right, so the rest of these test changes systematically, use external tools wherever it's relevant. There's some great tools out there that does prompt engineering. There's some great tools that allows you to store prompts, those sort of things. Use as many as you want. Also, don't be surprised if the model sometimes takes a little bit more time. Some suggestions when the model does take a little bit more time is, but these are actually generally best practice, is for you to essentially keep the conversation going with your end user, right? If this was a chat type model and chat type interface where someone is communicating, maybe under certain conditions, check to see if the user wants to do something else while they're waiting for the response, right? Or pop a dialogue up to say, well, what do you think? So the idea here is, if you're asking a lot and the model takes a long time to respond, keep your user busy. Do something else. Take the process further client side, right? Think about the expectation the user might have. Third-party tools, lots of them. I spoke about them already. And then you're testing your changes. This is something that you'd want to be doing on an ongoing basis. You will basically be able to start doing some red teaming. Now you'll notice just for that testing and these changes, of course you can use this OpenAI playground to do some of that testing and iteration if you like. However, to access the application from here, the user needs Azure permissions and Azure role-based access control to be able to use this test harness. So what you can do is you can actually go up to the chat here and you can say deploy to a new web app. This will deploy this chat service to a web application, and then you can give your other users access to this application to start testing it as well. All right. So I really hope that has made sense. I've used up all of the time. I apologize for that. But just to summarize, folks, what we've learned. What is Azure OpenAI? We spoke about this model and these models with a service. We spoke about content filtering. We spoke about temperature and top P and other parameters that you might use to control the output of these models. And then we spoke about the personas, the system, the assistant, and user messages that you can use to create context for the model. And then lastly, we finished off talking about these 6 strategies. I want to maybe see if there are any questions at this point in time, because I've covered what I wanted to cover, but I'm not sure if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Johan, for this insightful session. We have a couple of questions. The first one is from Manoj. He says, why is GPT-4 and Gemini now closed sourced? Money matters. Not sure if...
I don't know. That's probably nothing to do with Microsoft.
Yeah. Next question is from Carla. Is OpenAI still gated, or can people access it?
I think it's still gated though.
Then another question from Manoj. Is there a limit to the size we fine-tune on, as in the char length, etc.?
I'll check quickly. I think there will be actually under quotas and limits. So let me just check here. So you can see that there's a limit to the maximum number of fine-tuned models. I will just put this into the chat as well, and just drop this into the chat if you want to go and check it out. So what was the question? Is there a size limit to what?
I guess
size of all files, 1 gigabyte. I think that's more or less what you're looking for. Yeah.
And then one last question. Is Azure kind of calling OpenAI API behind the scenes, or they have the model on Microsoft infra?
I think even if you're calling the OpenAI model, you're recording it in Azure infrastructure. But this specific service runs on the Azure infrastructure. So you get your own instance running the actual model on a host. So yeah, no, this is not hosted anywhere else. It's hosted in our services, and I suspect that the OpenAI services are also hosted in our services. Okay, perfect. All right, well, folks, that's all from my side. I thank you very much for the questions. I hope that that was helpful to you. So I do apologize that we couldn't spend some more time. There's some areas I wanted to actually drill down into, but we didn't have time. So join us for the next session where we will pivot away from the OpenAI service. We will talk about our search and indexing capabilities in Azure. And then for the final session of the series, where we will bring the two together and look at that RAG type pattern that's become very prominent nowadays. Anyway, that's it from my side. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a great evening and afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.